You think you can sit there and mock a man's life like it's some damn circus? Clint Eastwood's voice cut through the air like a blade, his eyes narrowing at Stephen across the sleek desk. The audience, expecting the usual late-night banter, fell silent, their gasps swallowed by the tension. Stephen leaned back, a smirk curling his lips, his fingers drumming the desk as if Clint's words were just another cue for a punchline. He'd invited the legendary actor and director to discuss his decades-long career, but the conversation had veered into dangerous territory. Stephen, ever the provocateur, had prodded Clint about his political stances, his old-school values, and what he called outdated machismo in his films. The jab was meant to sting, to rile up the crowd, but Clint wasn't playing along. His weathered hands clenched into fists, knuckles whitening, as he leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "You don't get to twist my work into your little comedy act, pal. I've earned every scar I've got, and I don't need some smug talk show hack telling me who I am." The crowd murmured, sensing the shift from playful to perilous. Stephen, undeterred, doubled down, his tone dripping with condescension. "Oh, come on, Clint, lighten up. It's just a show. People love a little spice. Don't tell me you're too brittle to handle a joke." The word brittle hung in the air, a deliberate taunt, and Clint's jaw tightened. He wasn't here to be anyone's punching bag, especially not for a host who thought wit was a weapon to wield without consequence. Stephen's eyes gleamed with the thrill of the fight, his career built on these moments of manufactured drama, but he'd miscalculated. Clint wasn't just another guest to prod for laughs. He was a man forged in a different era, one where respect was earned through grit, not gifted by a studio audience. The argument had started innocently enough, with Stephen asking about Clint's latest directorial project, a gritty war film celebrating sacrifice and loyalty. But Stephen, sensing a chance to play to the room, had pivoted to Clint's personal beliefs, questioning why his films glorified violence and clung to old-fashioned ideals. Clint had tried to keep it civil, explaining his respect for those who served, for men and women who faced real battles, not just verbal sparring on a soundstage. But Stephen pushed harder, his questions laced with mockery, implying Clint's worldview was a relic, irrelevant to a modern audience. The crowd, loyal to Stephen's charm, chuckled at first, but the laughter faded as Clint's patience did. "You want to talk about violence?" Clint snapped, his voice rising. "I've seen it up close, kid. Not in your cushy little studio, but in stories of men who bled for something bigger than themselves. You wouldn't last a day in their boots." Stephen's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, tossing out a quip about Clint's age, suggesting he was out of touch, too stubborn to see the world had moved on. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the line had been crossed. Clint's eyes burned with a fire that hadn't dimmed in his 90-plus years, a man who'd faced down critics, studios, and time itself. He wasn't about to let Stephen reduce his life's work to a punchline. The air crackled with hostility, every word a spark threatening to ignite. Stephen, sensing the crowd's unease, tried to steer back to humor, but Clint wasn't having it. "You don't respect a damn thing, do you?" he growled, standing up, his chair scraping loudly. The audience held its breath, waiting for Stephen to defuse the moment, but he leaned into the chaos, his voice sharp. "Respect? I respect talent, Clint, but I don't bow to egos. Sit down, let's keep this fun." Clint's laugh was bitter, a sound that carried the weight of decades. "Fun? You wouldn't know fun if it punched you in the face." The crowd gasped again, some cheering, others stunned, as Clint towered over the desk, his presence commanding despite his age. Stephen, for the first time, looked rattled, his usual polish cracking under Clint's unrelenting glare. The showdown was no longer a game. It was personal, raw, and unstoppable. Clint Eastwood stood, his shadow looming over Stephen's desk, the audience caught in a stunned silence that felt like the calm before a storm. His words still echoed, You wouldn't know fun if it punched you in the face. And the crowd's mixed reactions, cheers clashing with nervous murmurs, only fueled the fire. Stephen, his composure fraying, gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale against the polished wood. He wasn't used to guests pushing back this hard, especially not a legend like Clint, whose mere presence demanded respect. But Stephen, ever the showman, couldn't resist the urge to claw back control. "All right, tough guy," he said, his voice sharp as a whip. "You want to play the big man, go ahead. But this is my stage, and I don't let guests run the show." The words were a challenge, a dare for Clint to either sit down or double down, and everyone knew which path he'd choose. Clint's eyes narrowed, his weathered face a map of defiance. "Your stage?" he spat, stepping closer, his boots heavy on the floor. "This ain't about your stage, Stephen. It's about you thinking you can tear down a man's life for a cheap laugh." The crowd erupted, some clapping for Clint's fire, others shouting for Stephen to fire back. The energy in the room was electric, a live wire ready to snap. Stephen stood now matching Clint's stance, his usual charm replaced by a cold edge. "You're not some untouchable icon here, Clint. You're a guest, and you're acting like a bully. My audience came for entertainment, not a lecture from a guy who thinks he's still in a Western." The jab was vicious, meant to cut deep, and it did. Clint's jaw clenched, his hands twitching as if itching to settle this the old-fashioned way. He leaned in, voice low but carrying to every corner of the studio. "You call me a bully? You're the one picking fights with a man twice your age, hiding behind your desk and your canned applause. You're a coward, Stephen, and you know it." The audience gasped, the insult landing like a punch. Stephen's face reddened, his eyes flashing with anger he couldn't mask. He'd underestimated Clint, expecting him to crumble under the pressure of a live audience. But Clint was a man who'd faced down worse than a sharp-tongued host. The argument had started over Clint's films, but it was now a clash of egos, of values, of two men who couldn't stand what the other represented. Stephen, desperate to regain the upper hand, turned to the crowd, arms outstretched. "Folks, can you believe this guy? Comes on my show, gets all high and mighty, and thinks he can lecture us on what's real. Maybe it's time you retired, Clint, before you embarrass yourself." The crowd's reaction was split, some booing Stephen's cruelty, others egging him on, hungry for more drama. Clint didn't flinch. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them, his voice a growl. "Embarrass myself? I've made movies that'll outlive your whole career, kid. You want to talk real? Let's talk about you, sitting there, mocking people who've actually lived, who've fought, who've got something to say. You're nothing but a parasite feeding off other people's stories." The word parasite hit like a grenade, and Stephen's smirk vanished. He stepped forward, inches from Clint, his voice rising to a shout. "You don't get to come here and insult me on my own show. You think you're above everyone because you've got a few Oscars? Get over yourself." The audience was on its feet now, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Producers in the wings whispered frantically, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the chaos unfold. Clint, unyielding, pointed a finger at Stephen's chest. "You invited me here, and you thought you could play me for a fool. You don't respect the people who watch your show, and you sure as hell don't respect me. I'm done with this circus." He turned, striding toward the stage's edge, the crowd roaring, some pleading for him to stay, others chanting his name. Stephen, panicking at the thought of losing control, shouted after him. "Run away, Clint. That's what you're good at, right? Dodging the tough questions." Clint froze, his back to Stephen, and the room held its breath, waiting for the next move in a showdown that felt like it could end in bloodshed. Clint Eastwood stood frozen at the stage's edge, Stephen's taunt, "Run away, Clint. That's what you're good at, right?" ringing in his ears like a gunshot. The audience, a sea of wide eyes and open mouths, waited, their cheers and jeers fading into a tense hush. Clint's shoulders squared, his hands curling into fists, and he turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Stephen with the intensity of a man who'd stared down outlaws on screen and critics off it. "You think I'm running?" he said, his voice a low rumble, each word deliberate, slicing through the studio's charged air. "I don't run from punks like you." He strode back toward Stephen, each step heavy with purpose, the crowd erupting into a chaotic mix of gasps and shouts. Stephen, caught off guard by Clint's return, scrambled to keep his footing, his face a mask of defiance masking a flicker of fear. "Oh, big man's back for more," Stephen sneered, but his voice cracked, betraying his unease. He leaned forward, hands planted on the desk, trying to reclaim his authority. "You're making a fool of yourself, Clint. This isn't one of your movies. You can't just swagger in and win." The audience stirred, some clapping for Stephen's jab, others booing his arrogance, but Clint's focus never wavered. He stopped just short of the desk, towering over Stephen, his presence a force that seemed to shrink the host in his own domain. "You're right. This ain't a movie," Clint growled, his voice thick with contempt. "This is real, and you're out of your depth. You want to talk about winning? I've built something that lasts. What have you got? A few laughs from folks who'll forget you by morning." The crowd roared, split between loyalty to Stephen's wit and awe at Clint's raw conviction. Stephen's eyes flashed with fury, his usual polish crumbling under the weight of Clint's words. "You arrogant old man," he spat, stepping around the desk to face Clint head-on, their faces inches apart. "You think you're untouchable because you're a legend? Legends fade, Clint. You're yesterday's news, and I'm the one who decides what's relevant now." The insult was a desperate swing, but it landed poorly. Clint's laugh was sharp, bitter, cutting through Stephen's bravado. "Relevant? You're a vulture picking at people's lives for ratings. You don't decide a damn thing about me." The audience was a powder keg now, some chanting Clint's name, others shouting for Stephen to fight back. The producers, frozen in the wings, signaled frantically to the crew, unsure whether to pull the plug or let the spectacle burn. Clint's finger jabbed toward Stephen's chest, not touching but close enough to make the host flinch. "You invited me here to tear me down, but you're the one looking small," Clint said, his voice steady but searing. "You don't know what it means to stand for something, to fight for something. All you've got is a loud mouth and a cheap suit." Stephen's face twisted, his control slipping entirely. "Get out!" he shouted, his voice shrill, pointing toward the exit. "You're done here? Go back to your ranch and your old man rants." The crowd gasped, the audacity of Stephen's outburst stunning even his loyal fans. Clint didn't budge, his eyes boring into Stephen's, unyielding. "You don't get to dismiss me," he said, his tone icy. "I've faced down worse than you and walked away taller. You're nothing but a loudmouth who thinks he's clever." The audience was on its feet, the noise deafening, a mix of cheers for Clint's defiance and boos for Stephen's venom. Stephen, desperate to salvage his show, turned to the crowd, arms raised, trying to rally them. "Come on, folks, you're here for me, right? Not this washed-up cowboy." But the response was lukewarm, the room's energy tilting toward Clint, who stood like a monument, unshaken. The crew, sensing disaster, began signaling for a commercial break, but Clint raised a hand, silencing the room. "I'm not done," he said, his voice commanding, every eye on him. "You want to know why? I'm here to remind you, and everyone watching, that some things don't bend to your snark. Honor, grit, truth, you wouldn't understand." He turned, not to leave, but to face the audience directly, his back to Stephen, dismissing him entirely. The crowd roared and Stephen's face fell, realizing he'd lost the room and the fight. Clint Eastwood faced the audience, his back to Stephen, who stood red-faced and fuming behind his desk, the crowd's roar washing over them like a tidal wave. The studio vibrated with energy, every shout and clap a testament to Clint's command of the moment. He'd turned Stephen's taunt into a rout, dismissing the host without a glance, his presence alone enough to make Stephen's earlier bravado seem hollow. "You want to know what makes a man?" Clint said, his voice steady, cutting through the noise like a preacher in a storm. "It ain't about who's loudest or who's got the biggest stage. It's about standing up when it counts, about living with scars you earned, not ones you faked for applause." The audience erupted, their cheers a wall of sound, many rising to their feet, drawn to the raw truth in his words. Stephen, scrambling to reclaim his show, stepped forward, his voice sharp but shaky. "Oh, spare us the sermon, Clint. You're not some hero riding off into the sunset. You're just an old man yelling at clouds." The jab was weak, a last-ditch effort to claw back control, but it fell flat. The crowd's loyalty had shifted, their cheers for Clint drowning out Stephen's. Desperate quip. Clint turned slightly, just enough to fix Stephen with a look that could have stopped a charging bull. "You're wrong, Stephen," he said, his tone calm but laced with steel. "I'm not yelling at clouds, I'm calling out a fraud, and you're standing right in front of me." The audience exploded again, some laughing, others shouting their approval, the sound a hammer to Stephen's ego. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came, his usual wit buried under the weight of Clint's unrelenting presence. The producers, now in full panic, signaled for the band to play, hoping music would break the tension. But Clint raised a hand, and even the musicians froze. "I came here to talk about my work," he said, addressing the crowd, his voice rising with conviction. "About stories of people who fought, who sacrificed, who stood for something real. But this guy—" He jerked a thumb toward Stephen, not bothering to look at him. "He thinks it's all a joke. He thinks you're here for his cheap shots. I know better. You're here for something true." The crowd roared louder, some chanting, "Clint! Clint!" as Stephen's face twisted with humiliation. He tried one last time, his voice shrill. "You're stealing my show, Eastwood. This is my time, my audience." But Clint was already moving, stepping toward the stage's edge, his stride, deliberate, unhurried. "Your show?" he said over his shoulder, his voice dripping with disdain. "You lost it the second you thought you could break me." The audience was a frenzy now, their applause a thunderclap, as Clint paused at the exit, turning one last time to face them. "Thanks for listening," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, connecting with the faces who'd come for a spectacle, but found something deeper. "Don't let anyone tell you what's worth fighting for." With that, he walked off, his boots echoing as he disappeared into the wings, leaving Stephen alone under the harsh studio glare. The host stood frozen, his smile gone, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to wave off the moment. "Well, folks," he stammered, forcing a laugh, "that's one way to end an interview." But the crowd's response was tepid, their energy spent on Clint, who'd left them with a fire Stephen couldn't match. The band finally played, a weak attempt to fill the void, as Stephen sank into his chair, his usual swagger replaced by a hollow stare. Backstage, Clint didn't linger. He grabbed his coat, nodded to a stunned crew member, and stepped out into the night, the city's hum a faint backdrop to the victory he'd claimed. The audience, still buzzing, spilled out, onto the streets, talking about the man who'd walked onto Stephen's stage and turned it into his own. Stephen's show would go on, but that night, Clint Eastwood had reminded everyone what it meant to stand tall, to speak truth, and to leave a mark that no amount of snark could erase. The crowd's cheers echoed in his wake, a testament to a legend who'd faced down a bully and walked away unbroken.